This is Where Did the Road Go? Our aim is to explore the fringe, to be true skeptics and question openly, to investigate the paranormal, bring light to the dark corners of history, and give a voice to the shunned of science. We deal in mystery and the important questions that these subjects bring to light. What is reality? Who are we? And why are we here? Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com for a full show archive, links to all our social media, upcoming schedule, and much, much more. Now, join your host Soraya on this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
And welcome to our first live show since I think the beginning of November. And the fact that it's live means if you wish, you can come into our chat room at wheredidtheroadgo.com and actually ask us questions that I will pass along to our guest. And our guest tonight is Mr. Alex Tsakiris. Did I say your name right?
Perfect, Soraya.
Okay, and you are the host of Skeptiko, a great podcast, one of the few podcasts I actually listen to regularly. It's different from most podcasts as you have kind of a very fine focus on consciousness in many different aspects. And you do it weekly?
You know, I'm getting them out every other week nowadays. Sometimes every week when they backlog, but every other week.
Okay, all right. And you just released a book, and the title of the book is what?
The title of the book is Science is Wrong About Almost Everything.
I love that. Now, you have an introduction from Rupert Sheldrake, and he said he didn't really like the title.
Yeah, you know, I love that. You know, we were just chatting a little bit before the show about, you know, one of the things I appreciate what you do on Where Did the Road Go is that, you know, you really do take this skeptical kind of thing seriously, and you challenge people and you say, hey, you know, what if I don't agree with you? And I'm the same way, and I like the fact that a distinguished scientist like Rupert Sheldrake, who is a friend of my show and a supporter, you know, would challenge me on the title. I gotta say, you're the first person to bring that up, and I'm glad you did it because I think he's wrong. I really think he's wrong, and I think that it kind of speaks to the fact that he is a scientist, and you know, he does have that training, and he is enmeshed in that institution. And I think it's hard for him to really take that really hard look at science and say, you know, gee, because the premise of my book is that science is clearly wrong about consciousness. Philosophically, it's wrong. Experimentally, it's been falsified. I mean, the scientific paradigm that we live in says that consciousness is an illusion, that it is a function of your brain, it's solely in your brain, and that you're basically this biological robot. That has been falsified over and over again, as I point out in the book, with good, hard research. I think once you falsify that notion, and then you start jamming it back into science and you go, okay, well, science is wrong about consciousness. It's wrong about who we are, where we came from. It's wrong about our minute-by-minute experience because it thinks it's an illusion and it's not. It's wrong about what happens to us after we die. You know, you start adding those up and you go, okay, can you really say that science is right or mostly right? I mean, I know it's provocative, but I take the position, no, science is wrong because consciousness comes into play in every scientific experiment, whether we measure it or not. It's there, and if they're dead wrong about consciousness, which they are, no pun intended, then you got to really question what they're right about.
Fair enough. I was wondering where you were going with that. I figured that was probably the aspect that since consciousness is a part of everything and they're wrong about consciousness, by default, they're wrong about everything on some level. I mean,
you know, I have a simple example that I give in the book, and I say, what if you were to take a really simple experiment, like you were to say, what's the boiling point of water, or maybe with the weather there, we should say, what's the freezing point of water? But
yeah,
the boiling point of water. You know, you say, oh, that's easy. It's 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And you say, well, wait a minute now. It boils a little faster at a higher altitude. So you got to know that. And then you got to know the purity of the water. Is it salt water? Is it fresh water? All this. So there are variables that you got to measure. That first answer isn't quite right. Well, let's take that same analogy and apply it to consciousness now. The reason that science works is because science makes the claim that we can measure. We can measure everything. That's what science is about. Science is about measurement. But if consciousness is more than what we said it is, this material thing that doesn't get involved in the outside world, is totally in the box, which is what science says it is. If it's more than that, then we have to start asking the question, is consciousness coming into play? Can consciousness make the water boil faster? But more practically, can the consciousness, if we pray for someone, can we make them heal? Can we communicate telepathically at a distance? All these things, if you really break them down, have an impact in science. So when we talk about the experimenter effect or the decline effect or even the placebo effect, these are all pointing to the fact that we really haven't nailed down this mystery. And if you think it doesn't matter, if you think you can just fudge the numbers a little bit, then you're really talking about engineering. You're not talking about science. I was a software engineer. That's my training. I know that every software program I've written and that every other engineer has written has bugs in it. We accept that. That's part of engineering. But we don't say that it's perfect in the way that scientific theories and scientific measurements purport to be.
Fair enough. The thing, too, is that there's this dichotomy. There's the sort of atheist, materialistic side, and then you have the super religious side. And when you mention their prayer, and you'll say, well, there's some evidence that if someone's prayed for it actually helps their healing, and the super religious side will be like, and it's proof of God, where it's not. It has something, it's proof of something. It's proof that consciousness has an effect on reality in a way we don't understand, but everything gets so polarized.
Oh, I totally agree with you. And I think that's really the shell game that's kind of being played. It's let's mesmerize you with this phony science versus religion debate over here, so you don't start asking these hard questions like you just were alluding to is, okay, what lies beyond biological robot? What lies beyond consciousness is an illusion? So once we say, okay, well, that's really a silly idea. It's been falsified experimentally. Well, then, like you say, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for prayer? What does that mean for near-death experience or death? What does that mean for past life regression and or just reincarnation research? Like there's some very solid, as you know, academic reincarnation research. What does it mean for all of those things? But we can't get there when, like you're alluding to, when as soon as you bring it up, people are like, oh, you're talking about baby Jesus and, empty tomb. It's like, no, man, I'm just saying that the thing that this whole science thing is built on is fake.
Yeah. Well, it's a very intentional thing, I'm sure, where you get the materialists, and the minute you mention anything that's not that can be connected to religion, they do everything they can to connect it to religion. That way it's easier to dismiss. But when you take it out of that shell of religion, the data is still there. And there's quite a bit of scientific data. I'm pretty sure it was your book. You mentioned the extraordinary evidence needs, or extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence comment. And why is that?
Exactly. I mean, and my point is, that's bullshit. What do you mean? Who is to determine what is an extraordinary claim? Who is to determine what is an extraordinary proof? I mean, the whole reason that we came up with science is because the methods of science the scientific method was because we realized that we have these biases as human beings, and we need to overcome those biases. So the way we do that is we have something called peer review, and we have the academy, and we have a level playing field. We don't impose after the fact another standard that says, that was pretty good, but it so goes against my belief system that is deemed extraordinary, and I must demand an extraordinary level of proof to that. That's completely counter to the idea of science.
Yeah, exactly. And because there was, I think you noted this in your book as well, there was a skeptic who acknowledged that some of this stuff exists from standard levels of proof, but that wasn't good enough for him.
Yeah, that's Richard Wiseman.
Okay.
If folks know, the very noted, highly regarded British parapsychology debunker and psychologist who is just famous for submarining every paranormal and parapsychology experiment. And yeah, it's like, the skeptics and the atheists, I don't know how they swallow some of the stuff that they swallow, but when Wiseman comes out and says, like you just quoted, and I'll have to paraphrase because I don't remember exactly the quote, but this is really close to it. He said, by normal means, I would have to say that ESP and parapsychology phenomena in general have been proven by any other means of science, but that begs the question, do we need another standard for these claims? Well, that's just nonsense. It's just nonsense.
Yeah, it's amazing. And plus, and you call him a debunker. Of course, he'll call himself a skeptic. But most of these people are not skeptics. They've hijacked the term. They've termed it to mean support for the status quo, basically.
Totally, and I think that's a really important distinction, because if you look at the positions that they take, it's always for the status quo, even when it doesn't seem to be within, their interest necessarily. It's defend the status quo, whether it's vaccines or whether it's climate change or whatever it is. It's always defend the status quo, even in those areas that don't come directly into play with paranormal kind of things. It's like, hey, man, defend the status quo.
Yeah, well, conspiracy theories fall into that same thing. They're automatically dismissed as if the idea of a conspiracy is ridiculous, despite the fact that we have so many in our history.
Exactly, and despite the fact that a lot of times they're propping up another conspiracy in place of the conspiracy that they're kind of
But it's
going against.
It's the accepted conspiracy.
Exactly right.
You gonna say something?
No, I was just going to say, along those lines, I mean, what do you think of that latest thing on the CDC and the vaccines? I mean, isn't that just stunning? I mean, there's a classic kind of a case of, the skeptics. They were way out in front of that vaccine.
Which one?
Oh, my gosh. If your listeners aren't aware, a whistleblower from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta came forward and admitted that he fudged the data that was the data for the vaccine to autism link. And he admitted it. And this is the data that everyone, that the British physician, Dr. Andrew Wakefield, his license was taken away, and he was just totally made a fool of in public, and he was, all this stuff. And then the skeptic came out and said, oh, there's no link, how ridiculous, all these experiments prove it, and this guy, and if you go on YouTube, you can actually hear the voice recordings of him saying, yes, we intentionally left out this data so that we could get the result that we want. I mean, it's an incredible admission. And now here's the real kicker, right? Is you haven't heard of it.
I have heard of it. I was wondering if it was that or something else more recent.
Well, you've probably heard of it because you keep your ear close to the ground. No one knows about this. It's not blasted on the news. You go look for it. There it is. The CDC even had to come out and issue on their website a public letter, although they watered it down. But it's right there, But it's it's hidden in plain sight kind of thing. So,
and I think the vaccine thing is a tough issue because there are people who just shun them completely, but they are eradicating some diseases that we really don't want coming back.
Well, it really does make it interesting. And, this is where I think my book, Why Science is Wrong, crosses into the conspiracy theory, but also the social, cultural kind of dynamic that we play. Because, I never covered the vaccine story. It's really out of my swing house. We're just kind of talking here. And
right.
I enjoy, that you have such a broad view on things and cover so many different topics. But let me digress into it for a minute. And that's that, the reason, if you kind of step back and look at it, the reason they all went after the vaccine, went after Wakefield and his connection that he established between these multiple vaccines, because his real thing was saying, look, you guys might have tested these vaccines individually, but the way these vaccines are being administered, people are giving 7 vaccines at a time. You never tested that. And the data seems to suggest there's a link. So then they had to rally because they didn't want the herd to not be vaccinated, because that would expose all of us to a resurgence of polio or something like that.
Yeah.
So, was there a motive? And I'm just speculating now. I can't know this for sure, but the evidence is out, folks. Go check it out, what we're talking about here. But, so there's 2 parts of that. Were they doing a good thing by kind of engineering this deception? I don't know. But the real scary part is they did engineer this deception, and they got it out just without any hesitation, because they have that machine cranked up to spin this stuff out there like that.
Yeah, and science in general, I mean, there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with the scientific method. It's that
of course not, right?
People get into the mix, and people are driven by agendas, they're driven by money, they're driven by politics and self-preservation. And the way our science system works, if you want funding for your project and your project turns out that it may be looking like it's not true, you're not going to go tell them that.
That's right. And now look at, where academia is at in terms of less funding, more people chasing fewer dollars. If you got that job in academia, you're not getting tenure, so they really have you on a short leash. You do what the heck you're told. You keep your damn job, So, there's not a lot of people sticking their neck out there.
And it's unfortunate. Even when you look at astrophysics with the electric universe stuff, I mean, here's a group of scientists who are making predictions that are dead on.
Right.
Whereas the mainstream science are making predictions that are dead wrong, yet the electric universe stuff just gets shoved over in the corner. It's not acknowledged.
Right. The other part of this that I've come to appreciate after doing this for 6 years and talking to so many, of these leading researchers and thinkers, is that we are kind of mesmerized and pitch this belief that progress is imminent. And, we're always trying to get to that next breakthrough innovation and stuff like that. And when you really step back, we're not. We're not doing that, because any business doesn't want that. A business, if you run a business, you don't want groundbreaking technological improvements that totally unset your existing business, right?
Exactly.
You like that little 10% better, 15% better. Oh, we made our engine, last another year or something like that. But you don't want your engine to last 20 years. You want a little obsolescence in there. Well, this is, I think, what we face over and over again, whether it's, the electric universe or low energy nuclear reaction or whatever it is. Not whatever it is, but over and over again, you see that. And I think when we look at consciousness, when we look at some of the breakthroughs that have been made and the discoveries that have made about consciousness that suggest that it's not this materialistic, reductionistic thing, it's the same principle. That is a very unsettling proposition for the existing status quo power structure. So, of course, it's going to be rejected. And of course, it's going to be, criticized, condemned, and made to look foolish at every turn. It's a lot like the UFO phenomenon.
Well, sure. And I think a good analogy of the small, the fact that the overall structure doesn't want change is when you look at the music industry. When, they were fine progressing from one thing to another as long as they had control of it. But when MP3s came out and it wasn't in their control, they tried to eliminate them.
Right.
Because they didn't want that change. They didn't want to jump to that because it was too unknown for them, and they didn't have the controls. They had controls over vinyl, over cassettes, over, CDs to some degree, but they didn't have it with MP3s. And suddenly they were panicking and probably, just pulled down the progress of the technology for years before finally accepting that it wasn't going away.
Yeah, I think there's so many cases of this that, really become obvious when you look at it, but we sometimes have a hard time stretching it into other areas because we're told that, oh no, don't look over there. That this part of science runs different. That might be true over in this part, but no, physics doesn't work like that. Or, oh no, biology doesn't work like that. Well, yeah, it's like you said, it's about people, and it's about the way that institutions and power and money work, and it's pervasive.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I wanted to ask you about the book is how come you didn't include a chapter on reincarnation?
I very well could have, definitely. I think some of the folks that I talked to, I just spoke with Jim Tucker from University of Virginia, who's written an excellent book. He's followed up on the research of Ian Stevenson, and his interview is on the Skeptiko website, where the book is culled from, over 250 interviews from there. But the interview with Jim didn't come until after the book was kind of in its final form. And what I have tried to do in the book, and as you know from listening to the show, is, I don't always, but I really like talking to the top researchers. Those are the people who I find have the most compelling data and the most compelling way of presenting it. So, I did talk to some folks along the way about reincarnation. I wish I would have had the opportunity to include Dr. Jim Tucker in the book, but like I say, it was kind of a timing thing. I think reincarnation is extremely important phenomena. It just cannot be, overemphasized how important it is, because it really speaks to this issue of, how long when does consciousness begin? It gets to that begin question, and it's really, really, you have to kind of take a big leap there, because the implications are that it begins forever. We're talking about the infinite there, which just blows your mind when you go to think about that.
Well, you can also consider that time is something we experience here, but if there is someplace other than here, it may not experience time the same way we do. Right. Our understanding of time is based on our senses. It's based on the way our brain processes reality. If we exist without that, what is time like then?
Totally with you. It's mind-blowing. I don't know how to process that, but I love what you're saying, in that, what I love about that? That to me is what I like to say, what I try and do on Skeptiko is just following the data wherever it leads. And that's what you're just doing right there. You're saying, look, I don't know what I hear you saying is you're not sure what that means, but just a clear read of the data says, that's it. Time, we know from Einstein, isn't real in the way that we experience it as this linear, that was a second ago, this is the next second. No, we know that's not true. And then we have all this other crazy stuff, near-death experience, reincarnation, past life regression. We have all that other stuff to throw in the mix. And you come to the conclusion that you did, that no, time must be fundamentally different from the way that we experience it in these bodies that we do. So I don't know what that means, but that seems to be true.
And I've always felt like there's past life regressions, which generally require hypnosis. I have mixed feelings about hypnosis to begin with. And when they're pulling this information up, if you're dealing with someone who's 40 years old, they may honestly be relaying to the hypnotist what they think is a past life, but it may have been something they encountered earlier in their life. It may have been something they subconsciously picked up. On the other hand, when you have a 2-year-old child who can give you details about their past life, that's fascinating to me, because where would they have picked this information up?
I agree. And just if I can interject about past life regression, because we did a very interesting show. We did a couple of shows on it. And I think it gets somewhat of a bad rap.
Oh, it does.
Yeah. There's these problems with past life regression. There's a problem with regression therapy in general. But when you really look at, the history of past life regression, the first guy to do it was a guy named Newton. And what happened was it happened spontaneously. So here's my point. If you're going to throw out hypnotic past life regression, then you better be ready to throw out hypnosis in general. And if you're going to throw out hypnosis, then you better go and do a good Google search of the scientific research on hypnosis. Because, buddy, they got it. They got it from Harvard. They got it from, a lot of the most prestigious schools where they'll do, one of the most interesting ones, and it's featured in my book by a guy named Mario Beauregard from University of Montreal. I don't know if you've ever spoken to him on Where Does the Road, but he wrote a great book called Brain Wars. And, the research that he cites in his book and that I use in my book is they took people and they hypnotized them into thinking that they were colorblind. Then they did a brain scan and they found that their brain acted like they were colorblind. Okay? So this does two things. One, it contributes to this falsification that you are a biological robot, because your thoughts are supposed to be immaterial. Your thoughts aren't supposed to be able to do any work, do anything. They're not supposed to be able to shut off parts of your brain. That's the strict interpretation of materialism. And this is just a small way that it does. But the other thing that it does is it shows that hypnosis is real. Hypnosis works. If you start with that and then you look at the protocol these people are doing for past life regression, you can call into question, that everyone goes back and thinks they were King George or whatever. But what Newton did in his regression is he was just taking somebody back to like this traumatic event that happened when they were very young. So he was going, you're going back, you're going further back. And the person goes, boom, I'm on a battlefield, with this kind of weapon. And he said, oh my gosh, it wasn't until later. And he repeated it and he found that these people seemed to be spontaneously going to, and the only thing he could figure was a past life. And that's really just the very tip of the iceberg and a loose telling of that original story. But there's been a lot of work done in past life regression. It's not an area that I focus on at all. I just find it fascinating.
Yeah. And what I guess my point is that when a 2-year-old can give you details that a 2-year-old shouldn't even understand, that can't be dismissed. I mean, there has to be some reason this kid can remember it. And the fact that those memories tend to fade as they get older, too, kind of suggests a connection to another life that's fading,
Yeah, that's intriguing, isn't it? Jim Tucker, the guy I was just telling you from the University of Virginia, tells this great story, and it's on the Skeptiko website. But it's about this boy, and it might be the boy you're alluding to. But there's this boy, and I think he was between 2, 3, 4 years old, because like you're saying, there's a really increased incidence of this past life memory for these preschool kids. And exactly like you're alluding to, then it seems to go away, and we're not quite sure whether it's socialization or whether it's somehow other that connection. But anyways, this kid is walking, or he's in the stroller going by the toy store, and he sees a toy plane, a World War II reproduction, just a little model plane, that you see. Yeah. And he goes, Mommy, that's the plane I used to fly. And, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, cool. And he goes, but the bombs are wrong underneath. Those aren't the bombs that they use. Those are, normally something else, pontoons or something,
Right.
Mother's like, this is really strange, you know, and this kid's fascinated by it. So it comes back, and Dad's into World War II, and they start talking about this. And the kid says, yeah, there was a fire. And then he's becoming upset, and he goes to his room. So his dad is intrigued, and they start digging into this story more and more. Eventually they contact Dr. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, because the University of Virginia is so famous for doing this very solid academic research into past life regression. And this kid tells an amazing story that his dad is able to corroborate by piecing together these war records and finding exactly, they really have a high degree of confidence that they found out who he was and what boat he was on and what plane he was flying off that boat. You know, it was an aircraft carrier in World War II. Fantastic story.
And I do think there's a short film made about this as well.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It's called like The Boy That Lived Before or something like that.
I'm sure you're right. I don't know it off the top of my head.
But yeah, I mean, that's the type of thing that's so much, you know, like I said, it's easy for people to dismiss hypnosis, regardless of what effects it has, because it's possible that you're still picking it up from somewhere else, that it's not an actual life. Maybe it's someone's history that you had gone through at some point, or something, or your brain created something. But these kids aren't making this up. They don't have the brain power to make it up like that. They don't have the concepts.
Yeah, and you know, the other thing that is really, really freaky, but you got to throw it in there, is, you know what Stevenson and Tucker, again at Virginia, did, is they started tracing birthmarks.
Yeah.
And they found that, did you see that? And that it was a lot of violent deaths. There is one, they found that the reincarnation often occurs quicker, and that sometimes there's a birthmark that directly corresponds to the area. You know, like somebody gets stabbed in the back and they got a birthmark in their back in the same area. Folks, if you don't believe me, you think I'm making it up, go look at these guys. Go look at their research published in peer-reviewed paper. They have photographs and they detailed accounts of exactly the kind of research they do. And I've talked to a number of, you know, academics who have told me, you know, I never believed this stuff. And I read Ian Stevenson's research, and I read his methodology and his tight protocols, and I couldn't come to any other conclusion because his research is just so good. I mean, these are trained academics. These aren't just guys who are moonlighting or doing this as a hobby. I mean, these are professional academics who are doing this research.
All right, we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Alex Tsakiris.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and not necessarily those of WVBR or its management. Where Did the Road Go can be heard first and usually live on WVBR Saturday nights at 11 p.m. Eastern. Go to wheredidtheroadgo.com to ask questions of our live guests through the chat room. Where Did the Road Go is then re-aired on Dark Matter Radio and Deprogrammed Radio. You can download all shows for free on the website, and you can subscribe to us on Stitcher, iTunes, YouTube, or Vimeo. Additional content can be found on our video channels. You will also find our upcoming schedule, book reviews, blogs, free book downloads, links, and more. We are also on Facebook and Twitter, and if you want to help support the show, there are links to donate to us. Everything you need can be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com.
And tonight we are talking about the many aspects of consciousness with Alex Tsakiris. And I want you to tell people where they can find your podcast, Skeptiko.
Sure, it's right. It's at skeptiko.com, and that's SKEPTIKO.
And why did you start doing this podcast?
You know, I did it just because I had these questions, and I thought it was, you know, podcasting was this great way to be able to get these really smart people that I was interested in to talk to me. So it was really just that. It was the vehicle, you know, and I think we might have talked about this before. I think you kind of share some of that same background.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Now, you've been doing this how many years?
over 6 years.
Okay, and all the people can access the whole archive, right?
Yeah, over 250 shows, all available for free download, MP3, full transcripts on 95% of them as well. So
Wow.
if you like to read it, you can read it, or you can listen to it, get it on iTunes, the whole thing there. We have a nice, lively community that on a forum that helps me out a lot, keeps me straight. They're not, there's some pretty hard-nosed skeptical people there, but, true skeptics, as we like to say. But, that's the one thing I think that a lot of folks don't appreciate, and you certainly do because you're playing that edge. But a lot of the people who are opposed to this ridiculous skeptical community, atheist community nonsense are not buying everything. We're on the other side saying, no, let's get past that silliness and let's really be skeptical and let's really tear this stuff apart, because there's a lot to really sort through here. I mean, look at the UFO community. I mean, you talk about, eating each other's, lunch there. I mean, it's a lot of controversy, and it's the same with parapsychology. It's the same with consciousness. There's a lot to sort out, even when you get past the silly skeptics.
And I think anytime in life, you're going to have your opinions, you're going to have your slight biases and stuff, but I think the best thing you can ever do is to try and just not let those make the decisions for you. When I go into something, even if I believe A, if I talk to someone and they make a convincing case for B, I'm now going to look at B, and then I'm going to look at A again and say, okay, which one makes more sense now that I have both stories?
I'm the same way, and that's just in my DNA. I don't understand how anyone does it any differently. I'm always astounded when people are, extremely dogmatic. I tell a story in Science, Why Science is Wrong about almost everything, about an investigation I did with a skeptic. We were going to do this joint investigation of psychic detectives, and we found this great case. Well, it's a horrible case. It's a murder case,
right?
A serial killer, and Nancy Orlean Weber was the psychic, and we had these two policemen, one a lieutenant in the New Jersey State Police, and another a captain in a town in New Jersey, who didn't even know each other, and came together on this case and said, "Wow, this woman was extraordinary. The information that she gave us." And Ben Radford, who is the skeptic and writes for Skeptic magazine, and I did this investigation. We interviewed these detectives separately and together on a conference call. And it's just stunning. Anyone can read it in the book. But, the police are directly telling the skeptic, no, you got it wrong. This is what I said. You've misreported it. And he still, to this day, won't admit. I mean, Soraya, anyone can go listen to the recording. Anyone can go read the transcript. It's right there. So it just baffles me when people's dogmatism is so strong that they're just blinded by it. And especially from these people that consider themselves in the critical thinking community, which is what they call themselves,
Yeah.
It's just stunning, and I think it throws a lot of us for a loop. I jump at the chance to dialogue/debate with those people. I have an open invitation anytime, anywhere, any, prominent skeptic or atheist wants to come on Skeptiko, please, if you're out there, email me, go to the website, drop me a note. You will get on the show. We'll move you to the front of the line, buddy. But they won't come. They're afraid to come. They get halfway into interviews. They duck out. They make embarrassingly terrible performances because they're trapped in this, talking points arguments that they get in. And once you move them past that and talk about real science questions, they're tongue-tied.
Yeah. I think we were talking about this right before we started here. The one that amazed me the most, what was her name? Patricia Churchwood?
Churchland.
Yeah. I knew I was going to get that wrong. For some reason, it's Wood stuck in my head. But that was one of the most just amazing interviews I've ever heard. This woman who's what is her official, what does she do?
She is quite prominent in the consciousness community. She's officially a professor of philosophy at University of California, San Diego. But she's called upon frequently to be in consciousness conferences and has written many books. And in our interview, as we were talking about, I mean, her performance was just stunning. And I think a lot of people were just shocked at her behavior, her defensiveness, and what really kind of set the thing off. I mean, I guess we were kind of poking at each other a little bit, but then finally I got to it and I said, look, here's the main point I have. You mention near-death experience research in this book, and you're citing this researcher, prominent near-death experience researcher, Dr. Pin van Lommel, cardiologist in the Netherlands. And I said, you've totally misquoted him. You've completely misrepresented what he said. And I just told her, and here on page whatever it was, 176 of your book, you say this. He said the exact opposite. I've interviewed him. He's said it in his book. He said it in my interview. He said this. And she just locked up. I mean, she
hung up.
She hung up. And then when I called her back, she claimed that she was having technical difficulties. And Soraya, you and I have done enough shows that we know when you hear the dog barking in the background, that the mic is probably on, so the claims of I can't get through, I hear the dog in the background. I think we're live here.
And the weird thing is she kept telling you, okay, yeah, we can continue. And then you'd call back and she'd have, quote, technical issues. And it was one of the most childish things I've ever heard.
It was pretty bizarre. It really was from a academic of her stature.
Yeah. And I mean, if she just didn't want to do it, she should have just ended the interview.
Yeah.
I mean,
I've had enough of those, so I know that's a common.
And it's usually the hardline skeptics that do this to you.
It is, and you know what is amazing to me, and I never would have known it before I started, but the parallels between the skeptical atheist, and I throw those two together, and sometimes people get on me for doing it, but really, the mindset and so many of the talking points and so many of the beliefs are just so much in parallel that they're almost hard to separate. But they're just like the Christian apologists. They really are. What I've found is that the people they most despise, the most they pit themselves against for being dogmatic, for being totally wed to the doctrine, for not being able to think outside the box. They're exactly the same. I mean, they're just exactly the same.
And it's really amazing when you realize that.
Yes.
Because they don't see it. If they saw it, they might actually do something about it. I would hope.
Yeah, you would hope.
So you cover, as you already mentioned, you cover psychic detectives in here, which I wasn't expecting. I didn't see that coming. That was some really interesting stuff. You also cover psychics and mediums, which I think the last time you were on, you were kind of like so-so on psychics and mediums.
Well, I hope I wasn't so-so. I think it's extremely important research. And again, one of the reasons I wanted to cover it in the book is because I really, really like the researcher that I'm featuring in the book, Dr. Julie Beischel, formerly from the University of Arizona, where she worked with Gary Schwartz, who pioneered a bunch of this research.
Right.
Gary Schwartz, stellar academic background, PhD, Harvard, head of the psychology department at Yale, and then goes to University of Arizona, gets interested in this medium research, gets run out of the profession of medium research by this hit job by Geraldo Rivera, which is a fascinating story in and of itself, the drama in that. But through this, one of his assistants, Dr. Julie Barshel, PhD, pharmacology, knows how to run a controlled experiment, picks up this work and has pursued it ever since. She is rock solid, man. I mean, you gotta you got to read her protocol. I mean, quadruple blinded, 5-way blinded. The researcher doesn't know the medium, doesn't know the sitter. I mean, they've just every possible control you can imagine they've accounted for. All the usual cold reading stuff that people throw at these, that the debunkers throw at them, has been completely controlled for, and she's getting positive results. So that's the kind of stuff I love to cover, because, and that's the reason why the skeptics don't like to debate this stuff, because how are you going to debate that? Well, what are you going to say?
It seems to me that the main thing they do is they just dismiss it. They don't acknowledge that. They take some other bad example and they use that instead.
Right, and they're just usually misinformed.
Yeah,
so they go back to the talking points. They go, oh, that's all been proven false. It's cold reading techniques. And you go, well, here's someone who's systematically controlled for every cold reading technique you can imagine, and she still gets positive results. And they're like, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, and then again, they kind of just change the subject.
Yeah.
It's so some of the other subjects you cover in this book, and I highly recommend the book. The book was a very enjoyable read, and you do a great job of mixing segments of your interviews with your own thoughts and your own interpretations on some of this stuff. I also found that anytime I read anything by Rupert Sheldrake, I could hear him saying it.
Oh, good.
You deal with healing in here. And this was really interesting because you were talking about how you did some healing experiments yourself.
I did. One of the interviews that I did a while back, pardon me, was a guy from out in your area, Dr. William Bankston. And Dr. Bankston has done some, kind of stumbled into, again, a trained professional academic, not in healing. If I remember correctly, he's a sociology professor. But it's a long story that I don't have time to go into, how he got interested in healing. It just kind of, he came across this guy. I guess I'll have to tell part of the story. He came across this guy who was a healer, or who claimed to be a healer. And he met him just, socially, like at a party or something like that.
Right.
And Bankston is this kind of great guy, a classic academic, classic scientist. He's a curious guy. He's like, really? You can do that? Well, let's do a little experiment here. And he started setting up these little just ad hoc experiments just for his own, edification, to see if he could kind of debunk this guy. Well, one experiment led to another experiment, and he just became overwhelmingly convinced that there was something to this. Soraya, he eventually, Bankston, set up this experiment with these mice at the University of New York, or I think, I'm almost sure, you can read in Bankston's book. Again, I apologize, folks, off the top of my head. I think it was NYU or was City College in New York. Bankston had a friend who was doing cancer research, and he went to him and said, what is the most slam dunk experiment I can do to test this idea of healing, hands-on healing, And the guy said, well, I got it right here. It's these mice. These mice have been bred to be tested for cancer. I mean, it's a horrible thing to think about, but this is how we test these things. They're injected with cancer. They die 27 days later. It's been repeated over and over again genetically. These mice are identical. No mice that's been injected with cancer has ever lived beyond 27 days. Here's your test. He sets them up. They put the mice in the cage. Bankston puts his hand over the cage. He isn't even a very experienced healer at this point. And he said, it's an amazing story, but he says, the first couple days, the tumors on the mice were getting worse. And he goes, I was really just feeling really bad about the experiment. I mean, I hated to begin with the idea of doing these experiments on these mice, but now I felt like we're letting these making these mice suffer even more. And through the insistence of his colleague, he persisted, And he said on the third or fourth day, the tumors erupted and the healing began and the mice were cured. And Bengtson says that he used to say that the mice went into remission, but he was corrected by his colleague who said, no, these mice have been cured. We can find no cancer in these mice. Now, Bengtson published that research, replicated that research, published the replication of that research, and has since, you can read his book, Dr. William Bengtson. You can read his interview on Skeptiko. You can read his interview in my book, Why Science is Wrong About Almost Everything. But this research is phenomenal. And beyond healing, it also obviously has huge effects for implications for how we are to understand consciousness. So the story that I relate in the book that I won't go into is that when I ran into a health issue, I had always made this kind of pact with myself that if I needed it, I was going to seek out a Bengtson healing and see if it could help me. And I think it did. I definitely experienced healing, and I definitely think the energy healing that I got contributed to that.
And did that stay like that? I mean, did
feel pretty good.
Good.
I feel pretty good. Yeah. No, it did. I've had a very nice return to health.
Nice.
It was heart palpitations, which aren't, it's kind of hard to say because people tell you it's not that big a deal. It's not. I'll tell you, it's a pretty big deal to me. And I went to the doctor. I went to the doctor, and they were like, you need to get over to the cardiologist now. So
yeah.
And I didn't go to the cardiologist, and I am it's over a year. I do not experience heart palpitations, or if I do, once in a while, no more than kind of we all experience them once in a while.
Right. Huh. One of the and we mentioned that Rupert Sheldrake did the intro to this, and you put some of his interviews in there, and he did, among other things, research on when dogs could tell when their owners were coming home, and he did very, very detailed scientific research about this to determine whether or not dogs had some sense of where their owners were and when they were heading home. And then you talk about James Randi. And Randy's one of those people that has always gotten under my skin. And every time I hear Rupert Sheldrake talk about him, it's just, it just justifies why he gets under my skin,
Well, the Randy story that you're alluding to there with regard to Sheldrake is a fascinating one, because what a lot of people don't know who haven't looked into James Randi is that he's a liar. I mean,
yes,
there's no better way to say it, but he even admits that he's a liar, folks. So it's not like I'm hanging some title on him. He admits that he's a liar, but then says in the same breath that sometimes it takes a liar to expose the truth. Not the way that science generally works, but I guess if you can get away with it, and if you can get away with, having 40-foot posters of yourself at these conferences that he runs, and how people can go to these conferences and not feel like they're right in the middle of a George Orwell scene. I don't know, but they do. But the story for Sheldrake and Randi is that, yes, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, biologist, found that there was this natural history. People report this phenomena over and over again. He's collected hundreds of letters from people who say, yes, I know that my dog has exhibited this knowing when I'm coming home behavior because my wife is there. My wife doesn't know when I'm coming home. I'm out, I'm doing odd jobs, or like I'm a plumber, no one knows when I'm coming home. And the dog knows, and my wife sees it again and again. So he decided to investigate it. He's obviously bright, extremely bright guy, Cambridge PhD biologist, published in Nature. Folks, he knows how to run controlled experiments. He knows how to test for whether it's sound or whether it's smell or any of the basic stuff. He controlled for all that, and he found these amazing results, amazing results. Well, James Randi, came out and said, oh no, we debunked that. We found a dog. We tested the dog. It's been debunked. Sheldrake challenged him. and said, send me the results. Where's the dog? And Randy, in typical fashion, came up with some...
Well, initially, Randy ignored him, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then go ahead, finish. Tell the rest of the story.
Well, you're better at telling the story,
Okay,
but he did initially ignore him, and he had to go over his head to get a response.
He persisted. Sheldrick persisted and said, you said you had this. You publicly, called me out. You said you had it. And Randy backed. First Randy said, the dog ate it or whatever, and then he backed down. He said, well, no, we don't have that. We don't have any of those results. We didn't do the test.
Yeah.
So, I mean, folks, this is what you call a lie.
Yeah.
And Randy's famous for debunking Uri Geller.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know whether he did or not on the Johnny Carson show, but one thing is for sure: James Randi lied when he said that he debunked Uri Geller's experiments at Stanford Research Institute, which you can go on Skeptiko.com, and I did a whole show on it, and you can see the video at Stanford Research Institute. Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ did the experiments, and what Randy claimed is that the guy filming the experiment, a guy named Pressman, faked it, and that Pressman admitted that he faked it. Well, that's a lie. Pressman came out and said, I did not fake it, I will justify in a court, I will sign an affidavit, I will do whatever I have to, but I did never at any time say that. Well, then Randy, said, well, I don't know where I heard that. Maybe I got it from a secondhand store.
But even his methodology, and you get this with a lot of the debunking skeptics. I would watch, growing up, see the stuff with Uri Geller, and of course James Randi was always there in tow on all these specials, and I was never sure whether or not Uri Geller was genuine or not. But you'd see James Randi use sleight of hand magic to do the same thing that Uri Geller was claiming to do with psychic ability, and to me, that's not debunking. That's leaving the possibility open that that's how it's being done, but that's not proving anything. No more than saying, well, I found out that in movies people don't really punch each other. They're faking it to make it look like a real punch. That means in real life no one ever punches anyone for real.
That's a really good point. And it is a strange twist that they've done because the more natural interpretation of that whole thing would be that there is a natural, real phenomena there that people have learned to recreate or create an illusion for. I mean, that really, if all bets were equal, that would be, just kind of your natural thing. It's not that somebody dreamed up something of, how to do some sleight of hand. It'd be, wow, this is something that really happens and they're trying to recreate it. I think that would make a lot more sense when it comes to mediumship or mind reading or that kind of thing. Really?
And I think anytime you put someone in the spotlight, too, you're probably going to get some degree of fakery just to make sure there's a good show. I think you see it on the paranormal shows on television. I think it's just that inevitability that you can't put out something with no results or people aren't going to come back.
Well, that's the whole other dynamic, and that's the Uri Geller thing. I mean, what one of the interesting things, and I just heard an interview with Uri Geller, who sounds like a very interesting guy,
Definitely.
Complicated in a lot of ways. I think those SRI experiments, again, you can watch the videos on YouTube or you can go to Skeptiko.com, are solid. And these guys aren't getting fooled. These researchers aren't getting fooled. But Geller really credits Randy with propelling his career to heights beyond he could have ever imagined.
Sure.
And not intentionally, but it's the old thing of, there's no such thing as bad publicity. And I think Geller is at this point kind of resigned to the fact that it was a great ride. And now I think if I'm reading Geller right, he's saying, hey, I benefit by playing both sides of, is it sometimes an illusion? Maybe it is. Is it sometimes real? Maybe it is. That just adds to the Geller mystique. And I don't know, folks. I mean, I know about the SRI stuff. I trust Puthoff and Targ, who are, PhDs of the highest caliber and have some kind of, if you look at their resumes, I mean, they've done some fabulous science, in their own right. I think they were able to control an experiment where Uri Geller shook dice inside of a metal box and then guessed what was inside, what the die said before they opened it up. That's not a hard experiment to control for, especially when you're providing the box and the dice.
Yeah.
I think they got that one right.
Well, and I think you see the same thing with John Edwards, because I read numerous tests that he did, that he was tested in very controlled circumstances and did very, very well. But, you hear even some of the producers, I think it was, came out and said, yeah, they have microphones around the audience to pick up information and stuff. And it goes into that showmanship thing. If he's off one night, he doesn't have a show.
Yeah. I mean, you have to feed the beast, right? I mean, you have to feed the thing that you create. At some point, you become a product, and you have to deliver, the product.
Well, that's it. That's why you can't really trust a lot of those shows. They may be, like the ghost hunting shows. They start coming up with more and more incredible stuff, and maybe they really are getting it. But, can you really honestly trust it? It's not scientific at that point because it's entertainment.
Well, and I think that's really a great aspect of what we do, what you do on Where Does the Road Go? Where Did the Road Go? And what I try and do on Skeptiko is, we're basically more or less independent. We can really explore these things without that, need to kind of go a certain way or be directed by someone. We can really kind of follow our passion, follow our nose, and that can really take you in some great places that you just can't go if you're part of some media organization that needs to put out a certain homogenized product.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit longer here with Alex. There's a couple other things in your book I want to get to. What else was there? There was I had something right in mind too. Damn. You did add a section on on evolution and Charles Darwin, which I found interesting. And one of your guests we had on here,
Roy Davis.
Yes. I didn't want to say his name wrong. I was drawing a blank there for a moment. We actually have his book up on the website for free.
Fabulous. I saw your interview with Roy. It's loaded in my iPod, and I don't know about most people. I don't always listen to him right on time, so I have loaded up, but I can't wait to listen to it. Really a guest I really, really enjoyed, and, your listeners will probably remember the interview that you did with him. But what I really love about Roy's story is here's a guy who's a BBC documentary producer at a very high level at BBC, running that department, and produces this highly acclaimed documentary on Charles Darwin and is out doing the roadshow to promote it. And some woman in the crowd says, you did the Charles Darwin thing, right? And, he proudly goes, yeah, I did. And he goes, well, you got the story wrong because you didn't mention Alfred Russel Wallace. And Davis, when I interviewed him, said, you know what? I knew she had me because I didn't know who Alfred Russel Wallace was. And, this is the kind of journalism we need. This is the kind of guy who, instead of, bluffing or shirking it off, or, more importantly, just getting past it and then never thinking about it again, he said, darn, I got the story wrong. I have a responsibility. I have to get the story right. And he dug back into his work and the profile and the interaction between Alfred Russel Wallace, who is acknowledged as the co-discoverer of evolution. Right. And for the longest time, until the last 50 years or so, when this fanaticism about Darwin became so prominent, it was taught in the books, especially in the UK and England, that, these are the co-discoverers of evolution. But what Davis reveals is that what really happened is that the ideas of Alfred Russel Wallace are really the ideas of evolution, and that Darwin his writings were parasitic, and he actually plagiarized Wallace in his book, and he makes an extremely compelling case. Didn't you think so? Did you find him?
I did. I found the book to be fantastic, and his. I mean, he's someone who followed the evidence. He didn't go into it with an agenda to make Darwin look good or bad or anything else. He said, well, let me see what's there. And when he followed the evidence, he said, wow, this is not what I expected. It looks like Darwin was not the person we thought he was.
And it's a great history story, and it's kind of as that romance of, it's about letters, which are kind of a lost art in our day and age.
Yeah.
But it's about these long, long letters that these two scientists are sending from other sides of the world. And it's about when those letters arrive and how they got there and what letters meant back then. And that was the internet, And he makes just a rock solid case that there is no way that those letters could have gotten to Darwin when he claimed, and that it matches up with all the entries in Darwin's book that are most important for writing it. It's highly damning for Darwin. There's just no other way around it.
And Wallace has a slightly different view of evolution. It isn't so much survival of the fittest.
Exactly, which I think is so wonderful, because if you're like me, as soon as you hear it, you feel your mind doing one of those little gear shifts. What Wallace points out is that it's not about survival of the fittest. It's about non-survival of the least fit.
Right.
So
and that makes so much more sense when you think about it that way.
Exactly. Of course it does. You don't have to be the fastest gazelle. You just can't be the slowest gazelle. And that's obviously true. The other point that Wallace makes, and folks, think about these points from a political, from a sociological, cultural angle. What does survival of the fittest mean? Capitalism, free market, materialism, shop to drop. What does you don't have to be the best, just don't be the worst. Group. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying, maybe this is why one wins out. But the other thing that Wallace says, again, it's not quite as obvious as the first one, but it kind of is, and that is that it's not about survival of the individual. It's about survival of the group. Because if the group doesn't survive, if the group doesn't remain intact and have the ability to breed and have the ability to flourish and pass along those genes in a robust way, then it doesn't work, right? I mean, if you just have one survivor, that ain't going to do you no good. It's survival of the group. And again, what are the political, how does that map with our politics, our culture?
True. The way we look at things now and the way that, this conversation wouldn't be complete if we didn't at least touch on the near-death experience.
I do talk a lot about near-death experience science, mainly because I was ignorant of it before I started Skeptiko. I never had a near-death experience. I don't know anyone close to me who's had a near-death experience. I think a lot of people do, but I didn't. So my understanding of it comes from the research. And the research, for those who are not acquainted with it, is overwhelming that consciousness survives death in some way we don't totally understand, but it seems to survive bodily death. And that research is, like I say, very, very solid.
Yeah, and, despite whatever people see in the, quote, afterlife, the stuff they see when they're out of their body can't be explained. And I know a lot of skeptics try to explain it away as, well, they're imagining it, but we've seen scientific tests that prove that they're not imagining it. They're able to accurately describe what's going on in a room from a position they're not in unless they were actually out of their body.
Very true. In one of the simplest experiments, it's not at all simple, I shouldn't say that, but relatively straightforward experiments was done by Dr. Penny Sartori.
Yes.
And here's what she did. She went into the cardiac ward. People have had a cardiac arrest, heart attack. And she interviewed them like they do, like these near-death experience researchers do, soon after their recovery. And what she did is she asked them to recount their resuscitation process. So, how did they bring you back to life? You were dead. You're clinically dead. How did they bring you back? Well, for people who didn't have a near-death experience or a memory of a near-death experience, they were kind of dumbfounded by that question. Like, well, what do you mean, lady? I was dead. And she goes, well, tell me what you think happened. And they would indulge her with the story. And what she found is those stories sounded a lot like what you see on TV. And they would just say, well, I think this happened and this happened. They just made up a story because that's what she asked them to do. Well, then she went that was her control group. And then she went to the folks who had a near-death experience, and she just asked them the same question. This, by the way, folks who want to kind of think that this is not solid research, man, this is research. This is how there's a way to do interviews. There's a way to statistically analyze results. This is sociology, psychology. This is the soft sciences. This is science, folks. This isn't anything to look down on. But anyway, she goes to the people who had a near-death experience, and she says the same thing. Tell me about your resuscitation. They go, oh, yeah, I'll tell you about my resuscitation. I was right up here. And they wheeled this cart in, and they couldn't get it past the door because the wheel was stuck. So they had to spin it around, and then they did this, and then they brought these paddles, but the paddles wouldn't work, so they had to wheel this. All this stuff that people wouldn't know. And from a hard science statistical standpoint, the end result is highly suggestible that the people, it's statistically significant in a major way, the difference between people who reported having a near-death experience and people who didn't in terms of being able to recount their resuscitation. Now, how do you explain that away? You can't, especially when you have all these detailed case studies published in like the New England Journal of Medicine. So these are highly, to get published, to get a case study published in the New England Journal of Medicine means that you are a highly respected physician. You're not making a mistake. You're not making this stuff up. So when those are case studies, right? Those aren't the kind of research that Penny Sartori did, but it's important. So when you have this large body of cases, and then when the researchers follow it up like Sartori did, and like Parnia did, and like Jeffrey Long did, and like Pim van Lommel did for 20 years at hospitals throughout the Netherlands, and published in the top medical journal, one of the top in the world, The Lancet. When you have all that, it's case closed. And that's what it is with near-death experience, but it's too hard for a lot of people to accept, so it remains in this fuzzy, oh, that's woo-woo,
Well, you had one interview in there where the guy pretty much acknowledged he never researched near-death experience because it's not real.
Yeah, I think he likened it to astrology.
Yes, he did.
Princeton neuroscientist, his name is going to escape me right now, which I'm kind of glad. Sometimes. But a Princeton man, an Ivy Leaguer, who when pressed, I've read, I said, so, you're dismissing all this, calling it astrology. Well, what have you read? And he said, well, I've read some of it. I said, well, name one near-death experience research paper that you've read. Couldn't name one. Again, I don't know if his memory was fading or if he was kind of not telling the truth, but, that's...
It seemed like he was just trying to dismiss it. Like there was no actual, because his belief system said this doesn't happen, he was just tossing it out, and he wasn't, he didn't feel like he needed to justify it to you.
I think that's the only way I can understand it as well.
It was amazing. We did have a question from a listener who wanted to know if you had any thoughts on gluten in the context of your book.
No. So again, as you've kind of done a nice job of kind of talking about, folks, when I say, science is wrong about almost everything, I kind of mean it. And I kind of also am not crazy enough to acknowledge that we live in a world that has an amazing amount of technological innovation, medical innovation that can be tied back to this wonderful tool we have, which is the scientific method. So, and what I stay focused on is this aspect of our existence called consciousness, that little voice inside our head that science tells us is an illusion. It isn't real. It's just something that your brain is doing, that you are, they have two ways of explaining it, Soraya. One, they either say it's an epiphenomena of your brain, which means your consciousness, that little voice inside your head, is just a product of your brain. Your brain is spitting it out like one of your vital organs spits out some fluid. Or when they get pressed into a corner and they realize that there's so much data that just falsifies that, what they'll move to is say it's an emergent property of the brain. And this is the kind of position that Dr. Patricia Churchland, who we're talking about, likes to kind of go to. It's an emergent property of the brain. So what they're saying is it's kind of like a sand dune, you know? Oh, wow, you know, well, sand dunes are real and they create these beautiful patterns, but they just emerge. Well, the problem is, even though that's true about sand dunes, we do know how sand dunes form.
Right.
Sand, wind, other weather conditions, you get sand dunes. But to say that consciousness, to say that I don't know what consciousness is, I don't know when it begins, when it ends, I don't know what's necessary and sufficient to cause consciousness, I don't know all those things, but I can therefore claim that it's somehow an emergent property of the brain. I got to call bull. You don't know. You haven't established that. So you're just trying to mask your ignorance by kind of throwing a curveball at everybody and say, oh, it's an emergent property of the brain. Prove it.
And I think one of the arguments, too, that they make is that, well, you know, if we do this to the brain, then you know, someone can't do this anymore. And to me, that's liking to, you know, okay, you're the driver of a car, and if you take out what makes the car turn right, that doesn't mean that you're any different. It just means the car has been disabled. And I think that's kind of the function the brain plays. It's an interpreter between this reality, our body, and our consciousness.
No, I think that's a good analogy.
And there's obviously interplay going on because we can affect the brain with the placebo method, with hypnosis, and you know, and things like that. Obviously, have an effect on body and brain that shouldn't, based on materialistic sciences.
Right. I mean, as you just said, of course, there's a tight correlation between mind and brain. No one can dispute that, but that doesn't mean that we understand what the relationship is. And hey, here's what's really, from a philosophical standpoint, here's what's really on the table, is what's primary.
Yeah.
Is matter primary or is consciousness primary? And that's back to like we're talking about like time. I mean, that's mind-blowing because, so if you look at the Indian philosophy, yoga philosophy, great wisdom thinkers from a long time ago, and Zen people, all that, what they will tell you is that people who have contemplated for a long time have come to the conclusion that consciousness is primary, that somehow consciousness is fundamental and consciousness creates matter. Again, in some way, I'm not, you know, I don't know how, you know, I'm just saying that philosophically, that's what you got to look at. You got to say, could that possibly be true? And again, there's a lot of people who have thought about it for a long time and said, yeah, that is the way that things really work. And it's a totally different way of looking at the world.
All right, we're about done, but I have one more question for you. How have you changed? How has your worldview changed from the time you started doing the Skeptiko till now?
It's changed tremendously, and I'm so glad and so thankful for the experience that I've had with the show. It's enriched my life in so many ways. It's changed so many of my belief systems. That in more ways than I can even tell you here, but I do try and chronicle it in the book, how I've changed, and I certainly chronicle it on my show. I mean, I've just followed my nose, Soraya, and just tried to follow the data, and I'm better for it. And anyone can do it. You know, you don't need to have extraordinary experiences. I haven't had any. I think it's wonderful. Well, I think people that have had them, you know, that's enriched their life. That's great, but I'm just a kind of guy who's just followed the data and it's changed me.
All right. And spell Skeptiko for people, because it's not spelled necessarily like people would think.
It's Skeptiko. So knockout at the end. KO is the tricky part.
And that's .com, right?
.com.
Okay. And the book is?
Why Science is Wrong About Almost Everything.
And it's available on Amazon?
Find it on Amazon. You sure will. And the website, I have a website for it, whyscienceiswrong.com.
Nice. Okay. You think you're going to end up writing another book at some point?
I don't know. I never thought I'd write the first one, so I wouldn't rule anything out.
All right. Well, I thank you for joining us, Alex. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I highly recommend your book to people. As I said, I found it to be a very interesting read. It's a very, and you wrote it very well. It's very easy to read. It's not going to bog people down in any way. And I also recommend your podcast. I very much enjoy the Skeptiko Podcast. It's one of a handful that I listen to very regularly. And, I look forward to your future ones.
Well, I appreciate it, Soraya. And you know I'm a fan of Where Did the Road Go? So I'm going to continue to listen to you as you listen to me. So we'll know out there in space. We're kind of hearing each other.
All right. We're going to take you out with some Psyche Corporation. This is Warring Worlds.